Yeah, well, good morning, everyone. From just our little bit of pre-conversation, you probably heard that there's no possible way to uh, properly encapsulate the entire life and work of our guest today in a very brief introduction. So I'll do my best, and I will miss so many parts because the little bit I got to read, about you. Beforehand, Dr. Bruchac was just incredibly impressive and just amazing. And I can't wait to hear more. But so today for our Sunday, Autumn 2021 Sunday Forum series on the Native American religious experience, we welcome a distinguished special guest, Dr. Joseph Bruchac, a proud Nulhegan Abenaki citizen and respected elder. Dr. Bruchac taught in the English department at nearby Skidmore College from 1970 to 1974, was then hired by the college to create a full scale program in a maximum security prison, Great Meadow Correctional Facility. He ran this program until 1981 when he received a Rockefeller Humanities Fellowship, which allowed him to research and write a book about Native American poets called Survival This Way. In the years since, he has continued to write and have more than 180 books published in many genres. His young adult novel about the Navajos in World War II, who created an unbreakable code talker, was recently included on a list of the 100 best young adult books of all time by Time magazine. Dr. Bruchac has been published in many magazines such as National Geographic, Smithsonian, Adirondack Life, the Paris Review, Highlights for Children, Aboriginal Voices, Junior Scholastic and Cricket. He has gained a reputation nationally and internationally as a Native American storyteller, performing throughout the United States and in Europe. So, with that said, I would like to welcome Dr. Bruchac to our conversation today.
Kwai kwai, Nitombak. Those words mean hello, my friends, in the Abenaki language, the language of my ancestors, the language that my son Jesse is teaching as the director of the School of Abenaki at Middlebury College, and a language that has a lot of beauty in it, as all languages do. When we say kwai kwai, we're saying hello. We say Nidonba, we say my friend, or Nidonbak, my friends. And it reminds us that we must greet each other as friends, and that you may recognize someone who's been a friend and also offer the opportunity to make a new friend when you greet in this way. Ndi Louise Soza Palanokida Hozid. I am called Joseph, or the Peaceful One. Ndai Salatogi Anlo Bizonbik Taladalonda Kaden. I'm of the area we call Saratoga, or the Medicine Spring Place, the Adirondack Mountain foothills region. Alnoba Nia Takiak. A human being is what I am, as are also all of you. And when we in the old days would gather together, well, the first thing to remember is you have to greet each other. And when we traveled in the past, not online, nor in cars, nor in automobiles of any kind, nor in airplanes, even on horses, we either walked or ran, or we traveled on the rivers and the lakes and the ocean. Those were our original highways. And as we approached a village that was not our own, one of the great traditions here in the Northeast was to sing from the canoe a song indicating you were coming in peace and asking to be invited to land your canoe and come on shore. So I'm going to begin by sharing with you one of those songs and then singing the response that would be made from the shore, assuming, of course, you want me to land my canoe with you today. Yoga, 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 no de, yoga, no da. Gayawani hey, yokyo hey, Gayawani hey, yokyo hey, Gayawani hey, yokyo hey, Gayawani hey, yokyo hey, yo, kwano de, yo, kwano da, yo, kwano de, yo, kwano da. Gayawani hey, yokyo hey, Gayawani hey, yokyo hey, Gayawani hey, yokyo hey, Gayawani hey, yokyo hey. Guanu de, guanu de, guanu de, guanu da de, guanu de, guanu de, guanu de, guanu da de, guanu de, guanu de, hey, guanu de, guanu de, hey, guanu de, guanu da de, guanu de, guanu da landed my canoe. I should point out that one of the great traditions among virtually all of the more than 500 different native nations we can point out in what we call the United States, one of those great traditions is that of giving thanks. For there are so many things we must be thankful for, gifts of the Creator, things that we are given without payment, things we are given without having to give anything in response. Although, of course, we say when we say thank you, in Abenaki it's uliuni, which means I return good to you, that we then are making a reciprocal relationship. And among my good friends, and actually some of my very distant past relatives, the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois people, the Mohawk Nation, the Ganyenke-Gaono, who are the people of this part of what is Turtle Island, as well as our Algonquian Abenaki people. Among the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois, there is a great tradition called the Thanksgiving Address. I've heard this many, many times from friends such as Tom Porter, a very respected elder, or my late friend Jake Swamp, or any number of other men and women who use this as a way to open any gathering, to remind us to always be thankful and to give thanks. So I'm going to do a very short version, only in English. In fact, I've had my friend Tom Porter at events, and the people at the event have said, Mr. Porter, we don't have much time, so could you do a very short version of your Thanksgiving address? And Tom has always smiled and said, of course, and then done a half-hour version. Very short version. But I'm just going to really abridge it and begin by saying, as I give this address, I'd like you to join your mind and your thoughts with me and also give thanks. And so I begin by giving thanks to our mother, this earth, who provides us with a place to stand, who gives life to all things. We join our minds and our hearts together, and we greet and thank our Mother Earth. We give greetings and we give thanks to the waters that flow through that earth like the blood that flows through our veins. Those waters are life itself, and we must greet and thank and always be grateful for the waters. I ask you to join your mind and your heart with me to greet and thank the waters. We give greetings and thanks for all the plants that grow up, for the flowers, the bushes, the trees, who provide us with shelter, who provide us with food, who help us make our homes. We greet and thank the trees, and we join our minds and hearts together to greet and thank them. We also give greetings and thanks to the medicine plants, those the Creator gave us to help us with our illnesses. And we greet and thank the three sisters, the corn, the beans, and the squash, who are the providers of life. We join our minds and our hearts together to greet and thank them. We give greetings and we give thanks to all of the animal people, those who we are told were here before us, who have taught us many things, who are companions and teachers, and also provide us often with our clothing and our food. And so we greet and thank all of the animals, join our minds and hearts together to do so. We greet and thank the birds, those who fly up into the sky, who inspire us with their songs, whose beauty is such that the rainbow is carried on their backs. We give greetings and thanks, join our minds and hearts together to do so for the birds. We greet and thank the winds that blow throughout this earth, that carry our breath, that breath which also is life itself and joins us with all living things. We give greetings and thanks to the four winds and join our minds and our hearts together in doing so. We give greetings and thanks to Kizos, the great sun, who gives us warmth and light. We could not live without its gifts. And so we greet and we thank, joining our minds and our hearts together, the great sun. We greet and thank Nanibon Sad, the night traveler, the grandmother moon, whose face shines down upon us in the night, reminding us, like a grandmother, that we always have those above us who love us. And so we greet and we thank our grandmother, the moon, and our minds and our hearts joined together. We greet and we thank the Awatawesuk, the little distant far above ones, the stars. Creator has placed them in the sky to give us guides, to remind us that we are never alone, that the light of life spreads throughout this great universe. We greet and thank, joining our minds and hearts together, the stars. We greet and thank indeed all of the people, those we know, those we do not know, those we have not yet met, those who will come in generations after us. We greet them, we thank them, and we join our minds and our hearts together to wish them health and help throughout the future. And then we greet and thank Katsinawask, the great mystery, the great spirit. We greet and we thank for all those things and join our minds and our hearts together. And so it is. Daleho. Now that's a very short version of the Thanksgiving address.
Mm.
You've seen it many of what people have called Native American religion, though we don't use that word ourselves. We simply call it life. For life is imbued with spirit, and all things are created, and all things must be recognized and treated with respect. A number of years ago, about not that long, only about 4 centuries, a group of Christian missionaries were in what is now called Long Island, and they spoke to a group of Algonquin people and asked them, before they began to teach the Word of God, which they were sure they knew nothing about, what is your impression of the Creator? How do you see God? And in response, those Algonquian people drew a circle upon the earth, and then a small circle within the center of that large one. The missionary said, well, what is that? And they said, this is the eye of the Creator, and that small circle in the center is we, human people. We are one small circle, always in the eye of the Creator, and everything we do is always seen by the great mystery. That was how they expressed their feeling about it. Now, in giving thanks, by the way, I have to give thanks to this water right now. You need to be. In recognizing Native religion, you should also recognize that we find no real quarrel between one tradition and another. In fact, a number of Native elders, for example, Red Jacket, who was a very prominent Seneca elder, once said, after hearing of the teachings of Christ, he said, are you sure this person was a white man? He sounds like an Indian to me. Many white men who love their brothers the way you say he does. And in fact, if you can convince the people around us to behave in that way, then we will gladly become Christian ourselves. But so far, they're not treating us that way at all. That's a paraphrase, of course. But that idea of the golden rule, which I think is very much a part of virtually every tradition that we might call religion, is certainly part of the understanding of indigenous people. That what you give, you then receive back in turn. That how you treat others, others will treat you. It's seen in our child rearing practices, which I think are very much a part of our spiritual tradition. The idea that if a child does something wrong, instead of shouting at them, instead of striking them, instead of making them feel bad, you would tell them a story. And a story serves 2 purposes. One, it is enjoyable, and therefore you listen and you remember. But secondly, it contains within it teaching, and that teaching, as you hold the story, will be there for you in the future. I was recently doing a program online for a group of teachers, and one of them, a young woman in her 20s, said, I just want you to know that I heard you tell this one particular story when I was in grade school, and it was just last year when I understood the lesson from it. And I said, well, it stayed with you, didn't it? And she said, yes, it did. And that idea that a story can teach, of course, is found in all of our great traditions. The parables and the stories that were told by Jesus are a good example of this. For we as human beings, I believe, were made by our Creator to hear and understand through story. Every person is given 2 ears and only 1 mouth. That's because we need to listen. As we listen, we will hear. As we listen, we will learn. But if our ears are closed, that ability to listen is not going to be available to us. And also, we have 2 ears, one on either side of our heads, so we can hear at least 2 sides of every story and not just see things in one simple way. We also have 2 eyes, so that we can see things in depth. And again, only one mouth, for you must look twice before you talk about what you think you're seeing. And then we have the idea of two nostrils to smell the air around us and distinguish that which is good and that which is not bad to smell. And then again, only one mouth. And those are the 7 sacred openings, as they're often called in our different traditions, within your head, those 7 sacred openings. And we're also reminded, I think of my Dene, my Navajo friends, of the sacred nature of breath. In fact, we use the word inspire in our English language, which means to breathe in. Inspiration is literally breathing in that breath of life, which gives life to all things that are moving and living upon the earth. And the Dene friends of mine say, when the Creator gave us breath, to remind us of that sacred wind on our fingertips are circles, which are like that whirlwind of life, where the Creator breathed breath into all beings. And therefore we have the fingerprints upon our hands, which are unique and different on each person, just as the Creator has made each of us a unique and a different person, unlike any other. We also have what I would call the teaching of the circle, the idea that in a circle, as round as this drum, we're all sitting around that circle, and we're all the same distance from the center. And in that circle, we can all see each other's faces, reminding us to pay attention to each other, to respect each other. And also in that circle, every place is unique, but also equal to every other place. That idea of the circle, therefore, is found within our gatherings, which are in circles. And one of the Luther Standing Bear, who was a Lakota writer and an elder and wrote several books, said that if you look around creation, you'll see how sacred the circle is to the Creator, because birds make their nests in a circle. The sun and moon are circles. The stars circle the sky. This earth itself is a great circle, and we are part of that as we go through our lives, a circle of life and breath, which connects us all together. There's also a book by Ohiesa, who was also a Lakota writer, and he also wrote a book called My Indian Boyhood. His name is Charles Alexander Eastman in English, but he speaks too of that idea of circularity and relationship being part of traditional, again I'll use the word religion, religious belief, because as I said earlier, the idea of religion sometimes implies that it is only practiced on one day of the week. That is Sunday when we gather together, for example, and do this, or if we have another faith, it might be Friday or Saturday. But I was told and taught by many different elders that every day is a sacred day, that every breath is a sacred thing. And thus for us to give thanks, we must do it constantly, all the time, for there is so much that we need to be thankful for. This time of Thanksgiving, as it is coming up, this time as the Native American month, which always be a bit too, the idea that only one day of the year would be a Thanksgiving day is kind of ridiculous to indigenous people. In fact, among the Haudenosaunee, my friends and teachers and relatives, it is a practice to have great Thanksgiving gatherings at various times of the year throughout the entire cycle of the year, so that now might be the harvest Thanksgiving, that in January there might be the Thanksgiving, which is the beginning of the year, the New Year's Thanksgiving. Then there is the time of planting, which is a Thanksgiving, the time of the green beans coming in, the bean Thanksgiving. And even before that, I forgot to mention the maple Thanksgiving, when the maple trees give the first blessing food of the year. In fact, I was taught by Dewa Santa, an elder of the Onondaga Nation known as Alice Papineau, the head of the Eel clan. Dewa Santa told me years ago that when we have the maple syrup and we tap the trees, we must take a drink of that water, first give a bit back to the root, and then drink that water, for it is a spring medicine, a special medicine that will give us many gifts and help us enjoy good health throughout the year. And therefore, we give thanks to the maple. So that idea, again, of Thanksgiving happening only once a year is a little strange to our indigenous people of all the different many nations. When we hear a story often is meant to teach us to be modest, to be humble, to remind us that we are not in charge of all things, that there are those who always know more and have more, and that no one may challenge that great mystery, the Creator itself. In fact, in one of our early stories, one of the first beings created is called Gluskomba, who supposedly the dust of creation fell upon the earth and Gluskomba shaped himself and was very proud of himself for having done that and challenged the great mystery to a contest. The great mystery said, well, what shall we do? And Gluskomba looked around and said, let us make the wind blow, and I will go first. And Gluskomba made the wind blow so hard it rooted the trees and flattened the grasses. Then he said, now it is your turn, what can you do? And the great mystery just whispered, Wurmsenbegeso, which means wind eagle, come. And the wind blew gently, and it lifted up the grasses, and it lifted up the trees, and smoothed the earth around the roots, and then it swirled and twisted up the hair of Gluskomba, who straightened his hair, but then it came a second time and twisted it further, a third time, and then the fourth time, it blew all the hair off the top of his head. And he felt his bald head and said, I'm just the one who talks about making things. You are the great mystery. You are the real creator. A simple little story, which I've told very briefly, is an example of the kind of humility that we are supposed to just naturally practice, not necessarily because we are always born humble, but we learn humility. If we learn anything through life, we understand by our mistakes what the things are that we need to know and do. In fact, I always wish to point out that we have stories, we have traditions, and some people talk of Native people as being, so connected to nature as if it is our second nature. It is part of us, and what we do is in such balance. We live such beautiful and pure lives. The myth of the noble savage, which was developed in Europe through a writer called Rousseau, who looked at people from the islands of the Pacific, Polynesians, and thought they lived these perfect, blameless lives with ignorant children of nature where they never did any wrong, which of course was very untrue. They're very sophisticated and complicated cultures, and this judgment was made just on the basis of meeting one Polynesian who was brought to France and played the part of the noble savage. In fact, we have our traditions, we have our stories, because like all human beings, we are imperfect. We make mistakes, sometimes really big ones, and our stories urge us not to make those same mistakes again. If you make a mistake once, you may learn from it. Twice, you're still learning. 3 times, you're not a very good learner. And 4 times, I don't know what's wrong with you. But the idea that a story should be a teaching tool and that we learn through story is a very powerful part of our tradition. I've talked a bit. I'd like to see if you have any questions for me before I go further. Because as we're gathered here together, I think of this as a circle, and in a circle, everybody has a place, and everybody has a time if they wish to speak. In fact, there's a little tradition that has become sort of popularized these days called the talking stick, where you'd say take something like a rattle or a specially ornamented stick, and in a circle, you pass it around. And the one who holds the stick is the one who speaks, and everyone else are those who listen. And then when you're finished, you may pass it on to the next person and give them their opportunity to speak. So if we could sort of symbolically pass the talking stick around, I'd like to hear anything you wish to ask or add to our conversation and take it from there. I guess I'll let Merle start things off.
Do you have the impression that the exposure to Christianity from some of the European missionaries was harmful to the ongoing spiritual life of the native peoples that had that encounter, that their sensibilities were quashed in some sense by the assumption of superiority of religion and therefore lack of acknowledgement of what was already there?
I would say it's a very complex question. I think in some cases, certain missionaries who came were very sympathetic, very understanding, and they did bring good things. But also that idea of superiority, that the only way to follow was one way, was very foreign to indigenous people around the world, as a matter of fact. Often when Christianity came, I know, for example, I have friends in Nigeria, Chinua Achebe, who was an incredible Nigerian writer, and his book, Things Fall Apart, I think should be required reading for everyone. Chinua told me in one part of Nigeria, they had Irish missionaries who came, and one of the traditions among the people in this spot was to keep the skulls of the ancestors in a special house. And the Irish missionaries went in and destroyed those skulls. And literally danced on them to crush them. And that was, I think, a great mistake, a lack of understanding and of connection. Within some Christian traditions, for example, Catholicism has often allowed the adoption of many traditional practices within the churches. I know, for example, the idea of Christ as an Indian is seen in many of the Roman Catholic churches on native reservations, and the priests see nothing wrong with that. I know that, for example, among the Friends, the brethren, the people who are called the Quakers, that there was a great understanding and connection between them and the native people that they proselytized among, and the fact that it was the Quakers who themselves were very influential in maintaining native communities in hard times. There were whole communities of so-called praying Indians who were Algonquin speakers, who were here in the Northeast, who were very consciously Christian and saw no conflict between that and also their traditional beliefs. In fact, thinking of Christian missionaries, there was a man named Samson Occam, who was a Christian missionary who was himself a Native American, an Algonquin native person who came from the Mohegan Nation. And he was such a great orator that he went to England and gave sermons all around the nation and raised money to build a college for Native Americans where they would study various things, including religious studies. He came back to the United States, discovered that his patron had not taken care of his own family, that Samson Occam's family was literally in a starving condition, living in a hut. And all of that money that he raised was used to found Dartmouth College, which was not a college for Indians. Although some Indians attended it, it was largely a college for wealthy, young white men. So there have been some interesting relationships between very devout Christian native people and often the religious tradition that they are serving, which hasn't always been equal. In some cases, it's been unequal. But I would say to this day that it's not an exaggeration to say the majority of Native Americans practice one Christian faith or another. But also are in many cases still aware and connected to traditional practices, such as, for example, that Thanksgiving address, which I think has nothing in it that is a quarrel with Christianity at all. And I believe that often, well, I have a friend named Jean-Heinz Jean, who was a German anthropologist and ethnologist, and he wrote a book about Africa called Wir nannten ihn Savagen, which means we named them savages. We named them savages, but they were not savages before we named them that. They were simply human beings. And I think that is the great failing of sometimes some of the missionary activities in this country and other countries, failing to recognize the rights of indigenous people to have their own traditions. And then it may not necessarily quarrel with Christian ideas, but the idea you have to eradicate everything which is traditional to replace it with Christianity, I think is the great sin of Christianity in dealing with people of other religions, other faiths, other languages. And it is something that led to some terrible abuses in the past. I know that, for example, the Crusades that came into the Holy Land resulted in the slaughter of indigenous people living in that land, some of whom were Muslim, some of whom were Jewish, and some of whom were actually Christians who were killed by crusaders because they just happened to be living in what was Palestine or whatever part of the Middle East that you want to name. So to me, the danger is always hypocrisy, a lack of humility, a lack of respect for others, which may make your tradition different than what you mean it to be. And again, I was raised as a Methodist, and I have great respect for the Methodist Church, but I don't agree with many things that were done in the past. And I include my stance on civil rights as well as a part of that, the fact that Christians could have slaves in this country, and that African Americans were repressed by good Christians, and that you had to find your own African American church in order to worship freely, is to me an example of a failure, not of Christianity, but of people who are supposedly practicing that religious tradition. I hope that.
Other questions people have?
Okay. I'll just comment quickly that in teaching in the public schools, we're not allowed to talk about God, and we're always looking for ways to. We are allowed to practice yoga and meditation. So I've been writing down a lot of your words so that I can use them to give thanks with the children as we do sing some Native American songs, which have been in our repertoire for a while with our instruments. And so thank you.
You're welcome.
So I wonder if during your whole life as a young man, as being brought up by, and I'm not sure if your parents, obviously they were Native Americans, and then how that has influenced you to become who you are today. It just seems like you must have had some bumps in the road because you were Native American.
Yes. Well, let me back up by saying I was raised primarily by my grandparents on my mother's side. Okay. I lived with them. I'm still in the same house here right this moment where I was raised. This house has been in the family for generations. Yes. And that was the Native side. But ironically, my grandfather in particular, who was quite brown-skinned, very visibly Native, would not talk about being Indian. He would say to me, he left school in 4th grade. He jumped out the window because they kept calling him a dirty Indian. Okay. And there was the feeling, Northeast, unless you're living on a reservation community and obviously identified as American Indian, that it was much safer to blend in and not call attention to the fact that you were indigenous. And so much of what I learned about my Native heritage, I did not learn directly from my grandparents, although my grandfather and grandmother never struck me. They would tell me not traditional stories, but stories of various kinds to teach me. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was that way with everyone until I went to school and discovered that spare the rod and spoil the child was the rule rather than the exception. Actually, there were grown-ups hitting children. I couldn't believe it. It was so shocking to me. What's going on? And in fact, I remember years later when I was walking through a grocery store with one of my sons, and there was a woman with 2 children ahead of us, and the little boy was misbehaving. And she started whomping the little boy and saying, "Didn't I tell you never to pick on your sister? Your sister is littler than you. Don't ever pick on anyone littler than you." And my son Jesse looked up and said, "Dad, what's going on? Isn't she bigger than him?" I said, yes, I'll explain it to you later. That idea of kindness to children and being aware of their feelings was something I grew up with my grandfather, who was also, he would thank a fish if he caught it, or he would show certain things of respect to the natural world that I thought everybody did. So it was not until my teenage years I began to learn more of my heritage on my own by seeking out relatives and friends and teachers. Although as a little kid, I would go to these tourist attractions, such as the Indian village in Lake George. There was a man named Ray Fadden with his family who was teaching there. He was Mohawk, and later he'd become a teacher and friend of mine, also known by the name of Dahana Dolans, and founded the Six Nations Iroquois Museum in Ontario, New York. Or we'd go to the Enchanted Forest, and there was a man there named Meadow little loon, Maurice Dennis, who was Abenaki Indian, who had created a whole Abenaki village in the Enchanted Forest and told stories. And he would later become a close friend of mine in my adult years and would begin to help me learn more of the Abenaki language. Or I would go to any number of places, such as Frontier Town, where there was a man named Swift Eagle and his family, who was a Pueblo and Apache elder from Santo Domingo, Pueblo. And he also told stories and talked about Native traditions, which really affected me as a child. And then as an adult, he would again become a friend and a teacher. Or I would, for example, the Onondaga Reservation, I went to Syracuse University and would drive out there on my motorcycle every day and almost every day and sit and listen to elders talking and telling stories. So I just had that. It was natural for me to do that because I had that with my grandparents, to listen to elders. And it's hard for some people to do. Some people don't pay attention to their grandparents. Some people don't think that there's wisdom in age. Whereas in my experience of growing up with grandparents who I knew were very wise, and then having that, reinforced by the traditional teachings, made me think, gee, I wish people would indeed listen. For example, one thing I was told is that when someone has white hair, it shows they have many snows upon their brow, and thus many winters, much experience. And we should listen to white hair, for they have gathered much in their years. A good friend of mine, Paula Gunn Allen, who was a wonderful writer from Laguna Pueblo, Paula told me that when she got her first gray hair, she had a big party for all her women friends because now everyone she had gray hair. Until then, she was just a child. Now that she had gray hair, she was really finally going to be respected. She's a very respected person already, but that was within her own traditional belief system. So, any other questions or whatever comments?
Margaret and I visited me for the first, many times, and Margaret for the first time, Mount Rushmore some years ago. And there was a Lakota storyteller, interpreter at one of the sites beneath the monument, who told this perspective of the Native peoples looking at the mountain. Mm-hmm. And came back 2 years later, and he had been removed.
Yes.
Because he was telling an alternative story to understanding what that mountain meant to the people of that nation.
Yeah, well, so-called Mount Rushmore was to Lakotas and Cheyenne and other Native people a very sacred place. It was the grandfathers. Those mountains were regarded as grandfathers, or places where people would come to pray. And then when they began, destroying what was originally there to create the faces of European white men who had in almost every case, not always, but in most cases, done things very repressive to Native Americans, it was seen as a very ironic and very inappropriate thing to do by indigenous people, and it is still viewed that way by indigenous people. So I think that there are many different stories to be told on this land, and sometimes you see only the European perspective that's been overlaid on top of a native perspective or a native reality, which still exists even though things have been changed.
Jean or Pete, do you have some questions we'd like to?
Yeah, Pete and I just finally moved into our new place. And so we're coming from the city into the country, a very beautiful area right along the Mohawk River. So I really appreciated your Thanksgiving litany. It was beautiful, and I will look that up and read it many times, I'm sure. But do you have any, I'm interested in the history of this area. We're like right outside of Amsterdam.
Yes.
On the Mohawk River. And, you know, I'd like to find out more about the history of the, you know, the native history of the area.
Okay, to give you a quick overview, this area of the Northeast was primarily Algonquin-speaking peoples, such as the Mohican Nation of the Hudson Valley and over into the Mohawk Valley. Until about 1,000 or 1,500 years ago, the accounts differ, when Haudenosaunee or Iroquois people migrated from the west and came into this region, so that the Mohawk Nation began to live along what is now called the Mohawk River. We call it the River of Rapids. And that Mohawk Nation was exemplified by being part of the 5 nations, the 5 Iroquois nations, which had joined together in peace after many, many years of warfare. A peacemaker was sent by the Creator, and they agreed to live in peace. They planted a symbolic pine tree. They placed a symbolic eagle on top of it, holding 5 arrows to stand for the 5 nations, which bound together are hard to break, but singly are easy to break. And they had ideas of democracy. They had 50 different representatives chosen by the clan mothers who would meet at Onondaga to come to a consensus of what to do in terms of any important dealing that the nation had. And Benjamin Franklin actually urged the United States and the 13 colonies to follow the example of the Iroquois and create a league with common goals and with representatives who would meet in one place and decide what they would do, 50 of them, and that they would meet at Onondaga, and they would have 2 divisions. There would be the Mohawk and the Oneida on one side, and the Seneca and the Cayuga on the other, like the House of Representatives and the Senate, and they would come together to form a consensus. And in fact, the symbol of the United States, the eagle holding 13 arrows, is directly borrowed from the League of the Haudenosaunee, or the Iroquois. And the pine tree was the first American flag, was the pine tree, that pine tree flag where people could join together under its branches. So we had the Mohawk people who were part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the area around Amsterdam is close to a place called Ganajahalege, or Canajoharie, the place of the clean pot. And there is a Mohawk community at Ganajahalege, which is open for people to visit. They have regular festivals when it's not COVID, and every year they have a strawberry festival. And they're right there along the river. In fact, if you go along the Mohawk River, you'll first come on the other side of Amsterdam to the shrine of Gadeli Dekakwitha, or Kateri, as they say in English, who is now a Catholic saint, who was a Mohawk woman. And then you'll go further, and you'll come to Ganajahalege, which is this community of several hundred acres, which is a working farm, and is on the site. It was the former county farm for retired people, and then it was purchased and given to this Mohawk group led by my friend Tom Porter, who's a Mohawk elder. And it is a really wonderful community and an interesting place to visit when, again, the COVID restrictions are gone. So keep your eyes out for that. I would say that it was originally Algonquin land, and then the Mohawk Valley was taken over by the Haudenosaunee people. And so the division line between the Iroquois, as the Haudenosaunee, the Mohicans and the Abenakis became something like the Hudson River.
Mm.
So the east of the Hudson was Algonquin speaking, west of the Hudson, especially along the Mohawk River, and further west was speaking one of the 5 nations languages of the Haudenosaunee. So there's a quick encapsulation of history. And the other thing is what happened recently is that when the French and Indian Wars, as they were called, the Algonquins were largely the allies of the French, and the Iroquois were largely the allies of the English, which created great division among them. And when the English won, a lot of Algonquin people were displaced in, say, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, and went to mission villages in Canada.
Mm.
So there are mission villages that still exist, although there are also smaller Algonquin communities in, for example, Maine, Passamaquoddy, Penobscot, Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and in New Hampshire, Penobscot, and Western Abenaki. And in Vermont, we have 5 state-recognized tribal nations who are all Western Abenaki. And the next thing that happened historically is that there was a Revolutionary War, the war of the father against the children, as the Iroquois put it. And the Haudenosaunee, who were the allies of the English, were divided. What can we do? Who should we support? So they had a great council meeting in Onondaga, and they could not come to an agreement. So they covered the fire, as they put it symbolically, and said, okay, each of these 5 nations, you can go your own way, decide what you want to do. And so the Mohawks and the Senecas in particular allied themselves with the British. And the Onondaga tried to remain neutral, and the Oneidas, and by then the Tuscaroras were part of the 5 nations, joining a 6th nation, allied themselves with the colonists. When George Washington was at Valley Forge, they had no food. And what happened is that thousands of bushels of corn were brought to them free by the Oneida and Tuscarora nation. And they say Washington probably would have starved at Valley Forge, and the revolution might have failed had it not been for the Oneidas and the Tuscaroras doing this great act of generosity. And there also were a number of native nations who fought on the American side in the Revolution. For example, there was a Mohican and a Stockbridge-Munsee regiment of soldiers who were Algonquin speakers who supported the American cause. When the Revolution was over, what happened then is that all of the 5 Iroquois nations had most of their land taken away from them, including the ones who had allied themselves with the Americans, and a great migration took place of Iroquois people into Canada, led by Joseph Brant, who was a high-ranking officer among the British and also a Mohawk Indian. And they formed a place called Brantford, Ontario, and the 6 Nations Reserve in Ontario, Canada, where many, many Iroquois people ended up. Many Mohawks went north into Canada, where there are 4 different Mohawk reserves. And one, Akwesasne, is right on the border. Half of it is in the United States, half of it or so is in Canada. And most of the native people of New York State lost their land. A small reservation at Onondaga, small reservation in Oneida, Mohawk Reservation in northern New York, and Seneca small reservations in the western part of the state. And then only 2 Algonquin recognized reservations, both on Long Island. So the native people got a really raw deal in that series of wars that took place, and the land was quite literally taken, treaties were broken, and land was divided among them. So there's a real quick summary of.
Thank you. I'm very glad that the names reflect the native people, and we haven't lost that.
That's true. Like or for example, we have places such as Connecticut, which is Quanituck, the Long River, or Massachusetts, which is the mountains, or for that matter, to the west of us, Haudenosaunee names such as Ohio, a beautiful place, or Skanyodaio, or Ontario, the beautiful lake. So there are many places on the land where the land remembers, even though many contemporary people have forgotten.
When we were at the Iroquois Museum, what was interesting to me, and I think I read it someplace too, that the symbol for peace is a pine tree
Yes.
And with the eagle on the top right.
The great tree of peace, and had 4 white roots that stretched to all the directions.
Yeah.
Anyone, any tribe, any nation, any person could trace that root back to Onondaga and stand beneath the tree of peace and live in peace. Although these days,
tree, pine,
because they've been very badly behaving in native communities, so sometimes they're not as welcome. For example, the Pueblo nations out west used to have this policy of anyone who came there would be given a bed for the night and food to eat. But during the 1960s and 70s, they were invaded by hippies. Not only did they set a bed and a meal, when the native got up in the morning, they discovered all their jewelry had been stolen by the hippies. No joke, this happened again and again. So now all the Pueblos in Mexico have what they call sunset rules, which is no one who's not from that Pueblo can remain there after sunset, all because of, the abuse of hospitality.
Now, was it a particular pine tree? It
is the white pine.
White pine. Oh, yes. Okay. Right.
5 needles, 5 nations of the Haudenosaunee. And also the white pine has wide spreading branches and is indigenous to this region.
Yeah. Okay.
Lee, we can't see you, but we're hoping you're listening. Do you have any comments or questions?
We can't hear.
I think you're muted. Lee.
Hi, I'm from New Jersey, where the Lenni Lenape tribes and the Delaware were. I've learned that New Jersey recognizes the tribes, but they are not federally recognized.
Yes.
What is the reason for that?
Well, if, for example, the Ramapo Nation of New Jersey, being an example, is recognized by the state, I have to point out this is a long and complicated, so I'll try to make it real short. But what happened is the federal government, during the Eisenhower administration, decided to pursue a policy of termination, which they would terminate or end all relationships between tribal nations and the United States. Therefore, all reservations would be terminated, their land would have to be sold, their tribal governments would have to be disbanded, and more than 300 native nations and communities were terminated during this period. And by the way, the person in charge of termination was the same guy during the Roosevelt administration who was in charge of creating the Japanese internment camps. History repeating itself. The policy of termination was ended, interestingly enough, by the most enlightened president in history relating to Native Americans. It was Richard M. Nixon.
Wow.
Really treated Native people with respect. He ended termination. He ended a policy called relocation, where Native people were sort of forced to leave their communities and sent to cities. And he started what he called the new era of self-determination in 1970. Meanwhile, those 300 Native nations had been, pardon the expression, screwed.
Yeah.
They tried to regain their recognition. Some did. The Menominee Nation did, but it lost half of its forest lands, which had been responsibly regulated by the Menominee for generations. And the Klamath Nation of Oregon regained its status, but lost 90% of its land. And most of what money they had, because they had money, had land held in common, all of a sudden it was individual. You had to pay taxes, people had to sell their land because they couldn't pay the land tax and so on. So what we have now in the United States is a situation where tribal nations, which have existed and continue to exist, like the Ramapo of New Jersey, as an example, are not recognized now by the federal government. So they have to apply for recognition, and the federal government has to agree to recognize them. However, to obtain recognition, you have to pass certain criteria. One, you have an unbroken record of tribal governance. Well, what do? And then, your governance, kicked out by the federal government in termination. You have to have a land base. What do you do when all your land was taken away from you during termination? So the qualifications to gain recognition by the federal government are often a bar too high to pass. You often cannot gain recognition, even though you're recognizably, everybody knows who you are. You are Native people with a recognized community. However, state recognition is not as stringent. And so we have over 30 state recognized tribes, including our Abenaki Nation in Vermont, which has been trying for 40 years to gain federal recognition unsuccessfully, or the Ramapo Nation in New Jersey, which has state recognition. And the importance of recognition is multiple. One, if you have state recognition, you can apply for federal money to support education in schools. I'm not saying you can go to college for free. I'm saying you can get funds in various entitlement programs. Two, because of something called the Native American Arts and Crafts Law, you cannot sell your things you've made as a Native American unless you are state or federally recognized. So it is illegal, if you're not a recognized tribal member, to create something and say, this was made by a Native American. You can't do it. It has to be federal or state recognition. And also things like the rights to hunt and fish in certain areas, which was Aboriginal right, was denied by termination or by non-recognition. One reason the Abenaki Nation in Vermont began 40 years ago, I've been part of this process ever since the beginning, to gain recognition, either federal or state, was because the federal government created something called the Missisquoi Wildlife Preserve, and this was a huge area of thousands of acres of swamp and river land that had been traditionally hunted and fished for generations by the Abenaki people. And now they were not allowed on their own land, where there were ceremonial areas, where there were, quite frankly, burial areas. They were now allowed not allowed to go on it or to hunt and fish as they had before. So that was why they began applying for recognition after having kept a low profile, for good reason, for generations. Why keep a low profile? Well, how about this? In the state of Vermont, they had something in the 1930s called the Eugenics Project.
Oh, yes.
To sterilize people who should kill their offspring, people who had inherited genetic diseases, people who had a history of criminality, people who were, quote, idiots, unquote, usually just not educated to certain standards, and people who were, pirates and so on. That's what they called Abenakis. So many Abenakis were targeted for that sterilization process. And it was not until the 1980s in trials that we had in Vermont, we were fishing without licenses deliberately to get to be taken into court, that the records of the Vermont Eugenics Commission were made public. There's actually a book called Building Better Vermonters, which is about Vermont eugenics. And I should say that the Eugenics Project in Vermont was so well documented that it was an inspiration to the scientists of Nazi Germany who created the policies of eugenics that were pursued there. And they recognized the work of Professor Perkins in Vermont with the University of Vermont. The state of Vermont and the University of Vermont have apologized in recent years to the Abenaki Nation for what was done. Another reason not to be recognized as Indian in the state of Maine. If you were recognized as Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Mi'kmaq, or Maliseet, the state could come and take your children and put them in orphanages or adopt them out because they would rule that you were not fit parents. Why? Because you didn't have enough of an income, because you were living in a way that was not comparable to the standard of living for other people in the state of Maine. There is a documentary film called Dawn Land. I recommend it. It talks about the Maine Indian Reparations Commission, which is up until the 1990s, children were being taken from their families and people were hiding their identity as Indian because of this. And the movie talks about and interviews people who were adopted out, who had to find their way back to their own communities as adults, families who lost their children, people who were responsible for this particular law. So being recognized as a Native American in the Northeast has sometimes contained some particular problems that other people, even African Americans, did not face. So I think that's one thing to understand in terms of why there is state recognition and not federal recognition in a number of places throughout the United States.
Unfortunately,
thank you so much.
I'm sorry, one more question and then we'll have to wind up, I think.
Yeah.
Did you have a question? I'm sorry, I kind of hit you off.
I think we have to have another session.
If that's the case, let me conclude by offering you a little bit of music on this native flute. The flute is an instrument given us by the trees, the cedar tree, and the birds, the woodpecker that made holes in a hollow branch, and the wind that blew across that branch and made the sound of that music. So let me play you a traditional song that will sort of transition into something else. A little bit of Amazing Grace in there.
Amazing Grace. Thank you so much.
Ulioni, I return good to you, and Ulipam Kani, I wish you good journeys.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Blessings, and may the Spirit continue to be with you in your journey.
Thank you.